Hello, comrades. Thank you for joining us for this relaunch of our education program. Thank you, Charlie, for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Tina. I'm going to do about 10-15 minutes on the technicalities of Brexit, and let's have a bit of a debate there to sort of clear out any understandings of what all this is about, and then we'll get on to what actually is going on now. Throughout, I'm just concentrating on the food and farming aspects, but they are very profound. I've been involved in food and farming politics for 40 or 50 years and had my fingers in lots of food pies. I'm on the board at something called the Larder in Preston, where we're involved in what's called the Preston model, and we're involved in the food and farming aspects of that. As I said, I've been involved in this for a long time. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to feed the world. I had social mobility there. I got to the best agricultural college in the world to study a PhD on soil ecology. I then realized it's not just a matter about producing more and more food, but it's about why people go hungry, why people are in poverty, and that obviously led to lots of other things. I've been on the National Committee for Unite on Food and Agricultural Workers for about 5 years, although I worked for Unite on the Health and Safety Executive probably for 30 years, and I've been a fellow at City University on food policy for quite some time. Everything I'm talking about, if you want to check it out, there's a website called Bittersweet Brexit, and it goes into all sorts of details if you want to follow all this lot up. Right, there are three aspects of the EU withdrawal which I want to concentrate on. The first is the institutions we're coming out of, and that predominantly refers to the laws. And 40% of all the laws we're coming out of are to do with food and farming. So that the big directives like the water directives, the pesticides and the habitats will all get lost, and the government will try and put something in place similar. The big issue though is the agricultural policy itself and its subsidies. Something like £3 billion came from the EU every year as part of their subsidy scheme, and most of that went to landowners, about £100 an acre. The present vague policy is that that will be replaced with public money for public goods, but we'll come back to that later. Already, guess what? The amount of subsidies has gone down by about half a billion. No surprise there. There's also another aspect of it coming out as an institution, that is something called protected foods. Cornish pasties, Scotch whisky, Melton Mowbray pies are all protected by something called geographic identification. They can now only be protected by the UK, they can't be protected by the EU. So it's hard to see how they're going to be protected. And what that means is anybody else could start producing Scotch whisky and calling it Scotch whisky. Curiously enough, just this week, the EU signed a deal with China that both China will respect the EU protected foods and the EU will respect China's protected foods. Nobody's talking about protecting our protected foods. The other big institution we come out of is all the regulations around standards. And the big one is we come out of the EU Food Safety Authority, EFSA, which had, it was in control of genetic modification, but also pesticides, which is where I have a particular concern. I was on the government's advisory committee on pesticides and have things to say about what may happen to our pesticide regulations once we come out. I'm just hoping this works. Yep. The second part of the Brexit is this coming out of the single market. And it's important to emphasize the single market is not just a free trade agreement. We're talking with the EU about an FTA, but the free trade, the single market is much more than that. The single market ensures the free movement of goods, capital, services and labour. But in the process, and this is what a lot of people don't seem to get, is it protects standards. It encourages farming and food to be of a higher standard than the rest of the world. And while that sounds noble, it's actually also a way of protecting the market so the prices stay high. The main problem in the world in terms of food is we can easily produce too much food. Everybody talks about it the other way around, but it's actually we produce far too much food. And so when you do that, the prices plummet. So what the EU does is set standards which stops lots of people producing and only those that are prepared to invest. So it protects the market and stops other stuff coming in to challenge that market. I took that up with my Tory MP, somebody called Nigel Evans, but come back to me on that because he clearly didn't understand the significance of coming out of the single market. I think most of us are just beginning to realise about these standards because we keep hearing about chlorinated chicken and hormone beef and ractamine pigs, mainly in relationship to a possible US deal. But the one I like most is in America, they allow many more rat hairs in the peanut butter than we would allow. Our supermarkets wouldn't allow any rat hairs in any peanut butter. They'd be much stricter. And the government just recently voted down an amendment in the agricultural bill that's coming through, which was to try and stop lower standard food coming in. And even some of the Tories said, you know, that we had to stop cheaper, lower standards coming in, but the government ploughed through, and so basically anything can challenge our food. There's also the free movement of labour, and the free movement of labour is part of the single market and is one of the reasons why quite a lot of Conservatives wanted Brexit. And what that means is there's free movement of labour across the EU, which was particularly beneficial to the plantations in the east of the country. We're growing our soft fruit and our vegetables. And it's unlikely that they can be replaced. Even during the furlough period just recently, the Brits were walking off the job pretty quickly. So special planes have been used to fly in non-EU labour, particularly from Russia and Ukraine. Other parts of the food sector are dependent on migrant workers, particularly food factories, food manufacturing factories, and they've been at greater risk of the virus too. Most abattoirs are run by migrant workers, and many of our vets have come from the EU because we've run down our vet provision in the last 30 years. So they're not turning up either. So we're going to have a problem with labour. Then the other bit I want to talk about before which I just stop and take in the questions is the second part of the EU we come out of, other than single market, is the customs union. And that's quite different. It's basically a border all the way around Europe where the taxes are levied on food coming in. And there are something like 2,000 tariffs on farm goods and a further 15,000 on food products like cakes and biscuits. And they're even more complicated than the agricultural products. These will all require checks between the EU and the UK. Hence, that's why we're talking about 50,000 people being trained up in Kent to check. In other words, all those lorries coming from Europe will require checks to be able to take the taxes on that food, which previously was the purveyor of the EU. That now would be the UK taking the taxes. So whatever deal there will have to be some sort of tax collection, and that most of the food industry recognise will slow the movement of food down, because most of our food in this country comes through JIT, just-in-time systems. You know, the shop in Birmingham expects the lorry in Spain to leave at 5 o'clock in the morning and be in Birmingham 5 o'clock the next night, so they can do this, that and the other. And any barrier on that is bound to make food more expensive because of the taxes and checks. If there's a no deal, there will be taxes and checks on either side of the channel. In other words, stuff coming into Britain will have to be taxed and stuff going into Europe will have to be taxed. And just to give you one example, the taxes on sheep and beef are about 40%. So the idea that lamb, and something like 90% of our lamb exports goes to Europe, that will have a free flow is ludicrous, because as soon as it hits France, there will be something like a 40% tax on the lamb. So the hopes of our lamb farmers selling into Europe in the future are going to be very limited. But shall I just pause there, Tina, and take some questions to make sure that everybody's following what I'm up to? I can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself. We have one question already. Is it okay if I stop the screen share? Okay. So we can see you when you're answering. Oops. Have I stopped it? I have not stopped it. I think you have to stop it, actually, your end, if you could.
Me?
Yes, please.
What do I do?
To stop the screen share. Great, there you are.
Have I? Yeah.
We have one question from David Williams. In your opinion, does lower standards of imported food mean that it will equate to cheaper foods, or will any tariff offset that?
The aim is for cheaper food. I mean, and I think we should have afterwards, this is one of the big discussions we should have, because I think the Tories are going to say, oh, we want all these trade deals so we can have cheaper food. And there's a sense with us that we know there's so many people going to food banks that somehow cheaper food might solve that issue. But what I would say is it's not going to solve that. You know, there's all sorts of other reasons, but the cheaper foods will undercut our farmers because they're used to producing high quality food for the single market. And if they try and produce cheaper food, they're not going to be able to produce lamb as cheap as New Zealand. It's just impossible. You know, they've got ranches, thousands of acres, and, you know, the lambs just fall out, whereas we have to look after all ours. You know, it's just impossible to produce food cheaper than beef in Argentina. And that's the whole thrust of the US, is to get rid of their excess food to us cheaply. So it's going to be a very big issue, cheap food.
Another question here from Steve O'Neill, who seems to like wine. He's asking, how would it affect wine coming in from the EU, or will you go into that later? Is there a rule for wine?
Well, I'm just trying to remember that. I remember that the one thing we could do more, because what the case I make in the book is that overall we need to be producing much more food ourselves. When I were a lad, in the 70s, we grew something like 75% about the food we eat. We now only grow about 50%. And so we spend something like £66 billion a year importing food. And I think we could cut that by half quite easily to 33 billion. So that 33 billion we could spend on ourselves. And I remember in the book, thinking the one commodity which would make the most difference would be producing a lot more wine ourselves. That is some ridiculous amount of money we spend on wine, and I can't quite remember it off the top of my head. But it was like almost one of the biggest imports is wine. If we could produce a lot more wine ourselves, we would save ourselves a lot more money and paying the taxes coming in. But I can't quite remember the exact figure.
Isn't there an issue with the climate? I understand sort of in the Middle Ages it was really hot here and there was actually a lot of wine grapes growing here, but at the moment...
That's right. Well, it is curious. I was at Y College in Kent, and at the same time as me, and I was upset I never met this guy called Edward Hyams. He's written a brilliant book called Soils and Civilization, and he's one of the few agriculturists with similar politics to myself. There aren't many left-wing horticulturists around, and he was one of them. And he actually was the one that found vines in Kent from Roman times. I thought, well, hang on, if they could grow here in Roman times, why can't we grow them now? And since then, what, 30 or 40 years ago, we now produce a lot more grapes ourselves. And as I understand it, the quality of them is up to Champagne standard in the right places. And we're growing vines right up to Morecambe, and I've got them in my glass house at the back. So we can do it, you know.
Okay. Okay, Marion wants to ask a question. I'm going to spotlight her quickly. Hello, Marion.
Yeah, my question is, we have to also think not about producing more, but the quality of food. Because I think, especially for a lot of working class people, getting hold of good quality food that is going to be healthy to maintain our bodies and to improve life is key for me. Yeah. And this crisis has highlighted it more with the increased use of food banks.
Yeah.
So I agree, we should be growing more, but we need to grow good quality food.
Can I finish on that with Marianne? Because you said that's the big issue. Can I finish the talk with that? Because that's what I want to address most. Yeah.
And the other thing is that in the Midlands, there's a place that does grow wine. It's called Halfpenny Green Winery, and they produce it, and they have a craft market there, and they have a delicatessen. I've not tried the wine because I'm not a big wine drinker, but I might next time and let people know what it's like.
There's lots of potential, but I'll come back to that point, Tina. Remind me at the end, because that's the big one. That's the big one.
Okay, I think that was all in terms of questions in that round. So if
so I'll share screen again and bat on.
Great.
Right, where am I? Oh, that's not it. Oh. We were doing well up till then, weren't we?
It always happens. There's so many things open on your screen that you end up.
Here we go. Right. So I've just got to I'll just rattle through those. Right. So bringing you up to date. Northern Ireland.
Your Word document, yeah? Is that the right thing you want us to see?
Can you see Northern Ireland?
No, we can see a Word document.
Right. Let's just note that down.
Origins of Species.
Oh, really? Oh, that's my book.
It looks good.
Well, yeah. That's the one I'm writing in spare time. Yeah. Because I am a soil zoologist, and what can you see now?
We can see you now. Still.
Really? We'll get there in a moment.
No worries.
Right. Share screen. Is that it?
That's it. Well done.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So let's bring it up to date. Right. Bojo's border down the Irish Sea. The whole point of it was, if you remember, that with the not wanting to create a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and so what the idea was to have the checks around the Irish Sea, and those checks would have had to do two things. Firstly, because they're outside the customs union, because the whole idea was Northern Ireland and Ireland, to all intents and purposes, would be inside the EU customs union. It would mean there would have to be checks in the Irish Sea. Similarly, because the standards of food are different, would be different between the UK and the EU will want to make sure whatever is being imported into the EU has the same standard as them, not our standards. So that was what was needed in the Irish Sea. Guess what? Of course, Bojo said first time off, oh, there'll be no checks in the sea, and if anybody ever here says so, just send me the paper and I'll put it in the shredder. That was his line. Gove then admits, well, actually, there are going to be checks in the Irish Sea because we need to do this, that, and the other. But they then said, oh, well, these will all be technical and we can just have a few bits of technology and it will all be all right. And then they realised it's not going to be that simple. So guess what? They've scrapped it. So I don't know what's going to happen there. The trade deals. This is what everything was about, wasn't it? The trade deals. And we've heard a lot about the US trade deal, but I'm not going to go into that much because I suspect other people others will come and talk about that. And again, there's my website. I'll send you this, Tina, this presentation, so you can pass it on. There's the website where the Trump trade deal is included in great detail. But just to say that in the last few months, the US has put a tax on whiskey, something to do with the rows with China and whatever. And of course, so Scotch whiskey is going to get a 25% tax on it. So our beloved leader, Liz Truss, is saying this is unfair. And I can't help but think, if that's a negotiating position, it's a bit like a 7-year-old, isn't it? Yeah, it's unfair, you know, as if the world is fair. But the one I think that's attracted all the attention is the Japanese deal, which looks like being signed, which is very much the same as the one the EU had with Japan, and actually is undermining our negotiating position with the EU a bit. But the curious one was, she was insisting that Stilton cheese should have no tariffs on it going into Japan. Curiously enough, she brought that up in the New Zealand deal as well, when trying to do a deal with New Zealand. Clearly what they want is obviously to ship more sheep and lamb stuff to us. But she was wanting to ship Stilton cheese to them. And there was a fascinating review by the Vice President, Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, who said when our negotiating team turned up, he said it was like a load of cricketers who hadn't been playing for the last 30 years, coming over here and expecting to win the Ashes. And I thought, that's about it, isn't it? The lack of experience and the expectations are ridiculous. So another of the ones they're after is India. And they basically, it's again trying to get the reduction of the tax on whiskey. You might think we're a bit preoccupied in flogging alcohol, but actually 40% of our food and drink exports are what the US call hard liquor. Most of our exports are whiskey and gin. So that's why, and the government has this idea that it wants to increase food exports, not reduce food imports, but increase food exports. And most of that's alcohol. The trouble is, India want in return for reducing the tax on whiskey, they want visas first, second, visas, third, more visas for more of their people to come to this country. And I think Truss finds that a bit of a hard sell, isn't it? But the big issue is that Australia, Brazil, Argentina, and the US all want to do the same thing. They're all wanting to get rid of their excess food, while we want to export our financial services. And we're going to lose that one every time. They are going to export more to us. So putting our farming community under much more threat. And this is like, the magnitude of this is similar to the repeal of the Corn Laws 150 years ago, basically. This is going to put the UK food and rural sector under massive pressures. And when I talk about farmers, I'm talking about rural areas like around here. I just can't see how they're going to survive. But we were told, of course, there was an oven deal, lovely mannerism, all ready and ready to go. And yet, for some reason, it doesn't seem to be working. So these are my predictions of what's going to happen. Food prices will rise. I can't see, despite all the talk about cheap food, the actual costs of implementing the checks is said to be at least £9 billion. One of the big pushes for Brexit came from the fisher folk. Something like 90% of fishing communities voted for Brexit. And that's one of the sticking points in the deal at the moment. I think they're going to be sold down the line myself. The city, the finance houses want access to the European markets, and they are more powerful than the fisher folk. So I'm pessimistic they're going to get what they want. curiously enough, if you listen to the shadow environment character, Luke Pollard in Labour, he's very good on other things we could be doing without coming out of Europe for fisher folk. In particular, most of the quotas are going to the big ships, whereas the small ships, which is what we depend on more actually, don't get the quotas. And a lot of the quotas, the fisher people said, oh, the EU's got all our quotas. The quotas which we have got, most of them have been sold to the Netherlands and Portugal anyway. So they're not our quotas, we've lost them. So that's one of our predictions. The second one is that farm profits will fall by half over the next 10 years. And that I've got from a big Strutt report. And that says, even if environmental payments double, and that's the payments to looking after the countryside, which the farmers are expecting is going to come in, even if those double, they're still not going to have anything like enough to live on. So my prediction is it's lamb farms to the slaughter. They're going to lose out on the tariffs, you know, because of the tariffs going into Europe. They're going to lose out on the lamb coming in from New Zealand, and they're going to lose out on the falling subsidies. So that's massive areas around here in Sheffield where Tin lives. You know, this is a sheep area. We're going to, the other so ELMS, that's the environment scheme, won't work. I just don't see the point of it really. And it's so confusing. We're going to import even more of our food than the 50%. If we have all these trade deals, that's the only consequence there can be for the trade deals. More cheap food coming in. So I'm predicting our diet will get worse. Already, we obviously come out of the EU, we were the most obese country in Europe. We were also at the most ultra-processed food in Europe. And I can't see that getting better. The cheap food which we're talking about coming in is going to be the ultra-processed stuff coming in. The other prediction I'm making is that pesticides, which I said I kind of specialise in, we're going to move away from the EU system, which was of hazards, in which case it looked at the pesticide, could work out the inherent toxic characteristics of that, and then would say, oh, well, there should be a maximum level of that in food. And that was called maximum residue levels. And so supermarkets checked on the food coming in, and if the level of a pesticide exceeded that MRL, that didn't come in. It was quite strict and quite clear. That is going to move to a system whereby people can determine the risks. In other words, is that hazard actually going to be released? Who will actually be infected? Will it cause any damage? And you'll never guess who's come up with that idea. Somebody called Dominic Cummings. He's already saying this should, in the past, it was all these boring old experts. Now it should all be behind closed doors, and we will make judgments about whether something is safe according to the risks. So most people won't have spotted that, but that's Dom at it again.
Follow the science, yeah?
Yes. And then the final prediction, and I made these predictions immediately after the Tory landslide in December. And I said, Tate and Lyle will be knocking on the door of number 10. And Tate and Lyle, big cane sugar processors in this country, leading Brexiteers. They were the ones that were campaigning for Brexit all along. Well, they've already come up with the goods. Unbelievable and virtually unknown is, at the moment, we're in what's called a transition phase. At the moment, all the tariffs stay as they are. The tariffs in and out of Europe, they're all staying. There's a big line around everything. That will change at the end of the year. And as I say, if there's no deal, there will be tariffs on either side of the Channel and the Irish Sea. Already, though, one tariff has changed, just one. And that is the amount of sugarcane allowed into the country before the taxes kick in. And the taxes, so their quota called of 250,000 tonnes. 250,000 tonnes of raw sugar can now come into the country without any tax. when we were in Europe, that was taxed at the tune of about £120 million. So you'd think the tax which was going to the EU would now come to Britain, and because we've just allowed that to come into Britain. But no, the beneficiary of that is the American sugar refining company who owns Tate & Lyle, the only company that imports raw sugar for processing. So we've just taken off the EU £120 million and passed it to the American sugar refining company. And it's happened without anybody making any fuss whatsoever. But if anything explains, you know, shows what this is all about, you can't get much better example. And and that fits in with what Marion was saying a bit earlier on, which is what I want to finish up on, is that's about the same amount of money that Marcus Rashford and the Sustain organisation managed to drag out of the government. Do you remember before the holidays, Rashford was saying school kids should get free meals, and eventually the government agreed, and that costs about 120 million, the same amount they've just given to the American sugar refining company. So this is what I propose, that the EU, present EU subsidies is for landowners. In the book, Bittersweet Brexit, I proposed instead of paying landowners, we pay workers in the food chain, notoriously badly off, use that money to pay them. And that could provide 30,000 people, that's about the number we're talking about in the food chain, with a decent living wage.
300,000 or 30,000?
300,000 on the land. They're just land ones, but you'd want to include the food workers. Since then, I thought that might be a useful political argument that workers get it rather than landowners, but actually to administrative would be very, very difficult. We can have a discussion about how that could happen, but it'd be difficult. So since then, I've thought, well, why not propose that local authorities get that money and they develop local healthy food networks with that sort of money. And as I say, I'm involved with Preston up the road. And that would mean, some working out the numbers, they would get £20 million to address poverty in their area. And I think they're better placed to see who should get the beneficiaries, where it's best spent to environmentally, and throughout this discussion, I'll argue locally produced food is much better environmentally than shipping it across the world. So if you have a local food chain with a local subsidy directed to that particular area, knowing, you know, the area better than anybody else, that's the way we start building our healthy food economy. And curiously enough, what I would say is we should use the subsidies to address poverty and sustainability together. And that might be revolutionary, it might be hopeful, but do you know where I get the idea from? America. The US system of subsidies is to give money to poor. They spend something like $50 billion, about the same as the whole of the EU, and they give it to 40 million people already on some sort of credit system. So they get about 120, 125 pounds a month. As a card, it used to be a voucher system. They get a card, they can go through a supermarket, nobody can see, you know, it's not demeaning. They can go through a supermarket and buy decent local food. And there's even an organic bit included, you know, to encourage organic growth. There's also funding for healthier living, what to do with the food, how to cook and what have you. And the more you look at it, you think that's what we want for our local authorities. Systems where they can give money to poor people who spend the money locally, the local economy benefits, the local farmers benefit, and hopefully many more people get decent food and they're not paying a premium for that healthy food. on top of it. So that's kind of where I hope that addresses Marion's question, that we should be addressing the poverty angle, but we want that not to be just about cheap food, we want that to be about healthy food. And in order to do that, we need subsidies to do it. Just as we subsidise the NHS, we should subsidise healthy food.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Fascinating. Thank you very much for that introduction.
What do I have to do?
I've switched it off. I've managed to.
Okay, I'm all right. Okay.
Sharing, so they can see you now. Comrades, if you have questions or comments, please click the raise hand button. Matthew has asked a question, so I'm going to make him into a panelist now, but others wanted to have questions as well. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand. I do have one, which is on your last point, you know, how to do it fairer, etc. And I hear what you're saying. I fear though that kind of system of the US system will keep the inequality alive. It makes people dependent on, you know, the government giving them subsidies, etc., which is not going to raise them to etc. What I would think though is that you know, should land really be owned, that much land, by so few people? I think one of the people who gets most money out of food subsidies, EU subsidies, sorry, for the land, is the Queen and Duke of so and so, Westminster.
Just up the road.
I know. I mean, does she really? You know, should that be allowed? I don't think so. I don't think so. So what about people, you know, working the land, running it, owning it by them, you know, together?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that would be a fairer, but it's
absolutely
a revolutionary answer.
Absolutely, I totally agree.
We are on it's a road, isn't it?
Can I just answer your point, Tina?
Sure, go on. Yes, please.
Yeah. The problem is at the moment with food banks, that's exactly what's the case is, isn't it? I think demeaning, you know, just people carrying on. Whereas the subsidy system, I agree, at the moment it's unequal, but the idea is it stimulates the local economy. For every £100 they get, they're spending it locally. So a local farmer, a local butcher or a local baker will benefit from that. And so we can build local economies around that. That's the longer road. And we're working with NEF, New Economics Foundation in Preston, to try and calculate what the returns would be on that sort of investment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, before I bring in Matthew, there's a question on the Q&A, which you don't have to answer straight away if you want a quick rest. Is there any way of finding what the future likely tariffs would be charged at? I guess it depends on which industry, etc., and which country you're doing the negotiations with. Do you want to answer that straight away, or shall I ask?
Well, absolutely impossible to answer. Remember, there's 2,000 of them. There's 160 countries. You know, it takes about 7 years to negotiate any trade deal. You know, the tariffs are going to be monumentally complex. Google algorithms couldn't cope with. So to actually try and predict what's going to happen, no idea. No idea. Other than they're going to let other food come in cheap without tariffs on. With these quotas, they're just going to open up the quotas to let stuff come in.
Okay, Matthew, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
That's Matthew. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things really. The first question really is the whole question of fishing. I mean, obviously, the thing is that fishing, of course, was the industry was wildly in favour of Brexit for one reason or another, but it's totally contradictory. I mean, for instance, here in Scotland, of course, most of it is totally dependent on the EU market, and in fact, particularly the stuff that actually makes money, like the shellfish industry, is entirely dependent on shipping at as great a shorter time period as possible to markets in Paris and Spain and so on.
Yep.
So the political effect of having those cut off will be quite devastating, I think. I mean, and it's very odd because you have a situation, say, I mean, sort of friends of mine did some work for the Clyde Fishermen's Association, for a very strange bunch of people. The leader of the Clyde Fishermen's Association, who's a big Brexiteer, actually lives in Spain most of the year. It's just bizarre. The other thing, of course, is in terms of farming. When you're saying, I mean, the problem is that really we can't. We've got in a position, and you can see it most in the States, where you cannot trust food to food processors. You know, and these guys actually control, you know, all of farming in the US, and enforce low standards, and enforce the use of hormones, and enforce bad livestock standards, etc., etc. The whole thing, and you can see, you know, I mean, yeah, and what they produce is positively bad for the health of the people who have to eat it. And we should be in favour of saying, well, you know, we can't tolerate this stuff anymore. You know, we need to actually, you know, take control of this whole industry and make sure that it actually has, you know, operates to the standards we as the consumers and the working class wish to actually eat the stuff. I mean, capitalism is actually bad for your health, you know, and this is the thing we should be saying about it.
Quite right.
Okay.
Charlie, did you want to reply straight
No,
away? Or should I take
no, I agree. Yeah, I think before the referendum, nobody really appreciated the stuff about standards. It's only come since, hasn't it?
Sorry, Charlie, you're very dark. I think.
Yes, I've just realised that. I'll tell you what. Is that better?
Slightly, yes.
Right. I was stopping the light, and the light's gone. You see, that's what's happening. Right. Yes, I don't. We're now aware of all these standards, you see, and I remember lobbying my Tory MP, Nigel Evans, you know, one of the 1922 committee, just before the election. I bumped into him while I was collecting my booze at one of the supermarkets, and I said, can I talk to you about your trade deals? And he was sort of saying, yes, we're going to sell cheese to New York and what have you. And I said, yeah, but what about all the other junk coming into the country? And he said, oh, no, we're all right. I'm a farming stock, and our standards will stop all this happening, you know, if we maintain our standards. And I said, but if we come out of the single market, there's no incentive to maintain the standards. The reason we produced those standards is so we can sell in the single market. And he didn't understand me. And I thought, then we've had it, you know, because if you're a farmer, unless you want to sell into Europe, you're not going to work to those standards. And since then, the government has actually said, oh, we'll let stuff in from other countries of lower standards. So I think farming is, I can't use that word, but you know what I'm trying to say.
I could say it as well, but I'm not going to. Okay. Susan is asking a question. You have to unmute yourself, I think. Yeah.
I really wanted to ask, if we're getting fresh, proper food, not full of additives, we need also, don't we, to make sure that people know how to cook it.
Yeah.
And a lot of youngsters don't. They're so used to buying ready food and shoving it in the microwave.
Yeah.
They've no idea what to do with proper food, what I call proper food.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any sort of plans to help with that?
I wish there were. In Preston, we have that as part of our system of Healthy Food Network. We've developed qualifications called Food Champions. And what they do is get people, you know, working class women through onto the courses, train them up, and then they go out and train up other people in how to cook.
Good idea.
And as I say, when I'm talking about the US, it's built into their system that they have education about how to cook. And without that, we've had it. And I totally agree. We need that. And we need to build it. The other thing we need to build in the time to do that as well. Because part of the big issue at the moment, I did a whole survey in the Northwest for a group going to poor deprived areas and asking people why they didn't eat better. And the general feeling was, oh, you just have to educate people. You know, that's just tell them what to do. That won't work. You know, if you had a hard day at work or a hard day at 3 jobs, and you're coming home, you know, and you haven't got time to cook, and the takeaway, they said, because they kept saying, there's too many takeaways. And I thought, well, you don't have to stop at a takeaway, but they do, because they're knackered, they're tired, they want to get home, they want to have something to eat. And so they just stop. So you can almost, round here, you can almost tell the poorer areas by the number of takeaways. So we have got to find ways that people can cook better, but in order to do that, we have to find ways to have more time. And one of the strangest occurrences during this pandemic was I noticed John Lewis was selling out of egg cups. And you think, what? And what it was people were having more time to sit down, breakfast, and have an egg. And he thought, what a state we've come to, that we're short of those 5 or 10 minutes to just sit down and have an egg together. Incredible, isn't it? So we've got to build that into the way we think as well. I'll just put a bit more light on.
Thank you. Can you imagine how much time we'll have under communism? Susan, were you finished, or did you have a...
No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
But Susan, you were finished, yeah, with your question? Yeah. Okay. I think, Ben, you had a question earlier on and then I knocked you out again. Did you still want to ask it?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Tina. And thank you, Charlie, for this talk. Very interesting. But no thank you for leaving me feeling thoroughly depressed at some of the things I'm learning about. But I was thinking about some of the consequences of the outcomes of the negotiations or not. And I was just wondering what you thought the actual fallout would look like, if you had any kind of insight. I mean, industrial, but also political, and what you thought could be the consequences going into what we know 2021, what you thought might happen, and what sort of time frames would things start to impact us.
Oh.
Can I ask a follow-up on that, Charlie, actually?
Go on.
Can I ask you a follow-up? Basically, when there aren't any agreements made, what system will be used? Because there will not be agreements on everything, will there?
I have to say, I dread what's going to happen. I'm pretty sure food prices are going to go up within a few months. We're going to see, but it's also connected with the virus, of course. When there was that pasta shortage, the Italians they all worked together to get the pasta to us. Well, that's not going to happen. There's going to be checks as borders. So the free movement of food is going to go. So I think the first thing we'll see price rises, and I can't rule out food shortages, unless somebody's got some plan for America to be standing on standby to ship stuff in. Of course, can I just remind people, that one of the reasons the EU has the single market and used to overproduce was because of what happened after the Second World War with the Marshall Plan. When we were hungry, the Americans shipped in the food, and we were in debt for many years afterwards. And that's why the EU went out of its way to make sure we produced a lot more food in Europe, because it never wanted to be beholden to the US again. Whereas I feel we might be in the future, and I'd prefer not to be, obviously. So I'm fearful that we might well see food shortages within 6 months, let's say. Yeah, but certainly price rises, big price rises. And the food shortage is just going to be the poor that's hit first. Again, look what happened in the COVID. The middle class well off through the retailers were all right. It was the people who were actually doing the work in the service sector that got clobbered. And there's a massive dysfunction in the food system. And so it would be, again, the poor people that would get clobbered first. Does that answer? As
usual. Thank you, Charlie. Annie Richardson hasn't spoken yet, so I'm going to bring her in next. Hello, Annie. You need to unmute yourself. You got it. Done. Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you for this opportunity. I just wanted to ask if you could explain a little bit about what the position on Brexit has been of British farmers Is it just a stereotype that they tend to vote Tory? Are they planning any lobbying campaigns, etc.?
Yes, yes. I was one of the few Labour chairs of our agricultural college here in Lancashire, and I used to thoroughly enjoy prodding the Tories, you know, because it was blue and blue throughout the agricultural college, and reminding them actually their better well-being was dependent on the Labour Act of 1947, which did them a favour, and they never wanted to recognise that. I think we could make a wedge with the farmers in the future. I think politically, if Labour could get together, we would see that we could make a wedge in the farming community. Clearly, the landowners, you know, shooting the whatever. But what happened in the referendum was that quite a lot of farmers voted for Brexit. But curiously enough, I only found out later the National Farmers Union, that's the bosses' union, not the workers' union, voted overwhelmingly on their council to remain. They could see, yeah, but they didn't campaign on it for some reason. I never found out why. So there's a few things going on. The political impact of the farming community on the government has declined quite dramatically, even in the last 3 or 4 years. They're not the political force they were, and they know it. So there was a demonstration, you know, about a month ago, of loads of tractors driving through to Whitehall, and they're making it about the standards issue, because they're saying quite simply and quite rightly, if stuff is coming in from abroad, you know, they are not going to be able to compete, and they can see it. So they see it as a standard. So I think we can get into those blue heartlands of the Tory farmers. I think it's possible. If we had, and I noticed actually Starmer, Pollard and somebody else, just last week, everybody was wearing a wheat sheaf, if you remember, and that was in solidarity with the farmers. And Starmer, Pollard and some said they'd been talking to the farmers about producing more food and protecting the standards. And they said that the farmers were listening, and I think they would be. So I think we have a chance to have a go at them in a way we've not had for 50 years. And I think if anybody wants to help work with me on that,
yeah,
please. Thank you. That sounds good. Thank you.
Well, this is an interesting question, isn't it? The sort of those self-employed petty bourgeois layers between the working class and the capitalists, they are ripe for winning over.
There's the big landowners, there's the farm, but there's a lot of farms around here who are very poor.
Yes.
They've got the land, they don't have any money. And I sort of have a bit of a contact with the churchy organisation, and they say the farmers won't go to the food banks because they wouldn't dare be seen going to food banks. So they're leaving food in churches locally for farmers to go and collect. You think, what a world we're coming to.
That's crazy. Okay, Marion's got another question.
No, it's more a contribution. I think we've got to organise and collectivise, taking on, because there are quite a few farmers that when I used to go to a farmer's market in Staffordshire, they were saying that they didn't get very much out the EU at their level because they were the smaller ones. So I think we do need to organise, but one of the demands of the early women's liberation movement was collectivised kitchens, because we didn't want to see women just being in the home. Now, I do think that there needs to be more education in this country about people knowing what food is, how you use it, what's nutritious and what's not. It's something I've had to learn, because I've got a major problem with my weight and my mobility through my weight. So I'm having to learn, but we should have learned a lot of this at school. But the key thing, we have to organise, and the thing about restaurants and that, but we could have collective kitchens, collective nurseries, so we do away with individualism and collectivise and share all the burdens, or if you want to call them that, and also get some of the positive No, so I think there's a lot of things we can be campaigning on, and I think we should try and influence Marcus Rashford and some of these other people that doesn't just talk about food, but the quality of food, and start placing demands on the food production. And like there's a few allotments around where I live in Winton Green in Birmingham. We need more allotments, and we need people to be able to grow food as well. But we need to be collectivising it, and we need to be arguing and campaigning. It's not just about food, but it's the quality of the food, because the health implications of having a poor diet, we're seeing the consequences now. So I think, you know, I'm quite happy to try and work with people to maybe try and see what we can do on this. But I think we should try and influence people like Marcus Rashford that have had a big impact to say, yes, we want children to be able to eat, but we want them to have quality food and not have all the crap. And we need to start campaigning to say that we're not going to have all the crap, the processed food. We want proper food, not rubbish that's put into it, all the chemicals and stuff that is put into it. And I think we'd be a healthier population. But we need to collectivise and organise, because I don't think it should be left to individuals to have to produce food, because, you know, a lot of working class people are having to do 2 and 3 jobs at the moment just to survive. So we need to organise and collectivise. And if we can start campaigning on that, we can maybe build a big enough base to overcome a lot of the negativism that's around. Because I do think with the crisis of with the pandemic, people are beginning to open up and look for different solutions to things. So we should try and be gearing towards that.
Thanks, Marion. Quite right. I think capitalism has no interest in producing quality fruit. It wants food. It wants to make a profit. That's the driving force there. So
basically, Marion, and I might revert into my Brummie accent, Marion, if I'm not careful. If you wanted to pick an example of what capitalism can do to us, then there's no better example than food. You just describe the commoditization, the individualism, the branding, instead of the collectivism and working together and all that. You can find it in food. What's upset me most of my life is that most of the left have not been interested in this for the last 30 years. I've been banging on, and a few of us others. And that food is always seen as a bit of a middle class issue, and certainly the farmers are all blue Tories. And yet, to me, it's probably the most important thing which we, as socialists, we should be fighting for. And if we've wasted the last 20 years, then perhaps we should be getting on with it now.
I think Brexit will speed it up. I get the impression. Okay, Dave Quinn, please. Hello. You're still muted, unfortunately.
Dave?
You're still muted. You don't show as muted, which is a bit strange. That's very odd. I'm going to bring in somebody else quickly. Maybe you could have a try with your microphone. Okay, Mark, hello.
Hi, Mark. Hello, mate.
Oh, you muted yourself again, Mark. You're unmuted and then muted again.
Good for me.
That's it.
Good evening. Firstly, I think it's important to note that in the past, Charlie has had considerable successes with the work that he has undertaken. And I think that's important, that we can on occasions actually win things that we're involved with, and because that encourages other people to be involved with. Charlie, back in the 1980s, set up what is possibly the most influential health and safety magazine in this country, which is called the Hazards magazine. And the impact of that is not to look at what happened afterwards, but to propose solutions before people got into difficulties at work. And he was very successful in that. And that magazine goes now to tens of thousands of shop stewards and workers, and is incredibly influential in making sure that those reps go out of their way to make sure that the chemicals that are coming in are safe, and all of those sorts of situations as well. And I've personally known Charlie for a very long time. He's one of the most, I've been involved a long time. He's one of the cleverest and forward-thinking individuals you could hope to work with. He's certainly open to discussions, debates, losing them occasionally and coming back with new ideas. He's continuously on the go. And as you can see, he's even older than me. So there's a fair bit of experience within him. The issue, we're not proposing here a revolutionary solution. A revolutionary solution is obviously we take over the land and we run it on our behalf. The fact is, even if we did take over the land, we don't have the skills to grow much stuff on it. We'd probably be all starving within a very short period of time. The socialist movement in this country certainly could not grow enough food for ourselves and feed everybody and look after ourselves. So that is actually where the situation is. So yes, we want the land, but we would also want people ultimately to have the skills in order to do that, basically. Many years ago, I bought a book called Who Owns Britain by Kevin Cahill, and it blew my mind away. I didn't really realise about the imbalances in the land ownership, and my aim was, I thought, well, we've got to get this land back, and it's not going to happen in my lifetime, unfortunately, is how I feel about it. The book that Charlie put together, I helped considerably putting that book together. I think it's important just to go back over the actual, the thing in the book. It's called Bittersweet Brexit, and the book, although both myself and Charlie are Remainers, was aimed at whether we were in Europe or not in Europe. In other words, the programme that Charlie has put forward was to be used whatever the situation was and things. And the book actually, despite being written 4 years ago, has proved remarkably resilient. I can't believe there'd be many trade union or labour movement books which 4 years afterwards would have proven so accurate in its description. So it's not just, there's so much stuff in there. Charlie mentioned he was on, obviously, Gardener's World, and that was about soil. It was about soil animals. It was about the necessity to protect soil and to make sure that in the future it exists in sufficient quality and quantity that we can grow the food that we want. So there's plenty of stuff in there that can be utilised, found out about, and educated about as well. There's a practical purpose to Charlie coming on and doing this talk as well, is that next year we are planning to look back 200 years to what is called rural rides. And this is where William Cobbett went across the country, picking out areas of where food was being grown. Myself and Charlie are intending to pick out 5 or 6 locations where over a couple of days we're going to walk those areas and point out areas where food isn't currently being grown but could. And our intention is to do this around the labour and trade union festivals. So, for example, the Durham Miners Gala, over into Burston, down into Tolpuddle, possibly around into Hastings. So there's a practicality about it. We do want people to look in their own locations and think about this. So it's not just what food we can eat, but also what food we can grow and to educate ourselves. And that's why Charlie is coming on here and making such appeals. Can I just say, we did try, God goodness, we did try so hard to get the previous Labour administration to take these issues very seriously. There is a whole book to be written about the desperate, how that was knocked back. And we did try with most of what we describe as the left-leaning MPs as well, to give them copies of the book and to hold discussions with them. the sad fact of reality was that they were not interested, and it's slightly disappointing for me as a socialist that, you know, Starmer's office has showed more interest in the subject than the previous administration did. I feel bitterly disappointed, to put it mildly. It's not one for going on too much about, but those are just some of my thoughts and some of the ideas. We've asked Pluto Press to give us back the rights to the book, and we hope to make the book available for free very shortly.
Wow, that sounds excellent. There's a few other things we're disappointed with Corbyn about. I'm sure we could draw up a list. Charlie, let's not at this meeting.
I like the little comments coming through. They're great.
Sorry.
I'm just saying, I like the comments coming through at the bottom. They're great.
Yeah. Okay, Ashley is the next person to ask a question. Hello.
Hiya.
Hiya.
So I'm currently studying agriculture at Reading University.
Ooh.
So my question to you, Charlie, is I believe the UK is something like 60% self-sufficient. Should we as a country be doing more to drive this? And also, in terms of the future for agriculture, do you think we should be investing into GMO crops, because less inputs for more outputs? And also looking at things in terms of, because the reason I said those points is because it will look into things, it will fall hand in hand with stuff like climate change, looking at soil health, promoting better health. And also, just to add something else into it, should we be teaching the young generation in classrooms about farming, so from farm to fork, because I don't think people know a lot about it or appreciate the food that they're eating.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Ashley. Okay, Charlie.
Well, I could spend about the next 3 days answering that one, Ashley. And Ashley, if you could put Ashley in touch with me, we can carry on talking later, right? And I can help out on a lot of things. The first thing I'd recommend is you find a book by a man called Spedding, who was the professor at Reading grasslands. He was professor of grasslands at Reading in the 60s. And the first page of his book changed the way I thought about agriculture. I was an ordinary agricultural scientist, and what I believed was the more food I could produce, the better the world would be and hunger would go. And from the age of 12, I had that vision and worked hard for it. And it was when I read Spedding, as I say, professor at Reading's book, his first page said, we've spent a lot of time and energy to not produce food. In fact, we've probably spent more time not producing food than actually producing food. And I thought, what's he on about? And I realized that's true. We do not have a problem of having to produce more food to feed people. That is not the problem. We can easily produce enough food. So I don't have any problem with GM, like some of my friends. But nor do I think it's the silver bullet that's going to answer the big issues. For instance, my mate is at Norwich, and he's just got a GM variety which protects against potato wilt, you know, the old potato blight. And I think that's great. But the idea that more production is going to solve the issue is not the case. We need to be producing more food generally across Britain. And the trouble with the GM and that is that it's only the richer farmers that can afford it, not the poorer ones. And so we actually need to produce more food generally, not just because capitalist agriculture is always the rich and the poor. You know, there's always unequal development, and GM is part of that equation. That's why a lot of people didn't like it. Not for the actual technology, but what it stood for. So I think we should be able to produce a lot more of our own food. As I say, in the 70s, we were producing 75% of our food. Now it's down to about 50. I think we could easily produce a lot more fruit, a lot more tomatoes, a lot more vegetables, but not in the way that it's done at the moment. You know, back-breaking conditions, shit wages, you know, in plantations, which is what I call what's going on in the east of the country. They've basically taken the plantation model from tropical crops and moved into temperate zones. We need a totally different way of growing food, much more locally, much more varied, smaller groups, communities, co-ops, all that lot. But it needs subsidising. And that's what the argument we're going to make. We want that subsidised rather than the bunch up on the hills up round here shooting their grouse, roughly speaking. Because grouse is probably the most unsustainable food imaginable. But Tina, yes, if you can put Ashley in touch with me, then I'm more than happy to carry on that conversation.
Will do.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I recall when I learned that we're throwing away so and so many, I can't even, tons of butter every year, the butter mountains of the European Union. It's crazy while people are starving in other countries. There's certainly a problem with how capitalism produces food, but also how it distributes it. There is a question I'm going to read out in the Q&A. Oh, that's a bit better now. You're a bit brighter.
God, is that better?
It's a bit better, yeah.
Yeah.
It got very dark. Hold on, I've lost it now.
I can always put the light on.
Okay, hold on a second. Oh yeah, somebody's asking, was Corbyn not interested in food production? Did you try to talk to him? Or was there any, you don't know.
I can't remember a word you said on that. Not, and as I say, it's not just that, you know, the left generally. And so I'm hoping this conversation, out of this conversation, some of the left see the importance of food politics. I think it's the most political issue there is going. And I could spend an hour doing the power politics of how America has used its food to influence the world in the Marshall Plan, but also anybody who's hungry. And a guy called Earl Butz always said, food is a weapon, and we must learn how to use it. And he was the Secretary of State for Agriculture in America. So let's not underestimate the power of this stuff. You know, it's not a middle class issue. It's a very important political issue. And I've had a difficulty throughout my life trying to persuade the left to take it up. Well,
we're listening.
Yes, that's why I'm here. Yes.
Stephen is asking, as somebody from a chemical manufacture town, will the laws around the production of pesticides, etc., be relaxed after Brexit?
Yes, I would think. Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a good thing, is it?
No. And as I said before, there's, you know, I'm not an organic. Well, I keep doing that. I'm not an organicist, as it were. I don't. Can you see me? What's going on?
Yes, yes, no, this looks good. Looks good. We can see you.
Oh, you're right. I'm not an organic. I believe that pesticides are useful, a bit like medicines are useful, but overused, a bit like antibiotics. You know, it causes all sorts of problems. But I can't help but think the control of pesticides is going to get much more lax if we come out of the EU. And I think the EU have got some of the stuff wrong. I think they've overdone it, especially on GM. But as I say, I saw Cummings was getting his fingers in this pie and sort of saying, well, we don't need hazards. We'll decide on the risks of pesticides. No.
Right. Okay, comrades. Okay, we have one more question here from the floor from Mick Kennedy, who'll be rejoining in a second. Slightly complicated. Make them into. Oh, where's he gone? Sorry. Oh, there's it. Mike, could you switch on your, Mick, sorry. Mick, could you switch on your camera, please? Charlie, you're going very dark again, and then you're back.
Yeah, tell you what.
Your screen goes all blurry.
How about that?
That's better. Oh, much better.
Oh, old-fashioned.
Okay.
Other nights are drawing in, aren't they?
Yes. Hello, Mick.
Right, thank you. Can you hear me, Charlie?
Yep.
Yeah. Charlie, I'm very impressed. I wasn't aware of you until now, but you certainly opened my eyes up to a few things. My question was, is there any chance the socialist government could actually turn this big tank around over a period of time? That's my question. Thank you.
Yes.
And how?
Yes.
How are we going to turn it around?
Well, we invest, give the money to the local authorities to invest in growing locally, giving the money to poorer people to spend locally, building the local economies that way, and the resilience, and stop. And I did a presentation to Accrington Council the other day, and I had a little sign there saying, you know, if you buy locally, the money ends up with your kid getting a jumper for the football, or, you know, a seat at whatever. Whereas if you buy in Aldi, you're just helping somebody, you know, buy their third home in, you know, Oklahoma or whatever. And I think we've got to start taking on that sort of idea, but not as a nationalistic, xenophobic way, but patriotic, local. And in terms of climate, we've got to make the environmental argument there as well. It's far too much of the money we spend on food. It looks cheap, but it's actually ending up in, they call them middlemen, I suppose. I don't know what they call now. But, you know, on the food markets, on the financiers, gambling with food, you look at the amount of money wasted, you know, just gambling food on the world markets is incredible. And we're dependent on that. I think we need to be much more resilient. And as I say, I think if we had a socialist vision, it would be about growing food and eating food better and provide, and it could be the center point, both in terms of health, but also economically. If we, as I said in the book, we, instead of spending 33 billion giving it to somebody else on the other side of the world, we spent it on ourselves. We could be building hospitals, there's social care. We could be doing all sorts of things without putting up tax. We could say, well, we're not going to put up your taxes. We're just going to ask you to do right under your nose, eat the food locally. The answer's right under our noses, and we push for that.
And democratization of the food production, I think, is also key, isn't it?
Oh.
Unless anybody's got any other questions, I think it's been a very, very interesting session. You made a very good case for taking the production of food and etc. as a very serious political question. I think it's definitely interesting. We were setting up a book club as well very soon, so that might be a very good opportunity to study your book in a bit more detail, because there's certainly sounds like a lot to learn from. You don't read the chat, they're talking about that you look like John McDonnell or something. It's not worth reading.
Do I look like Donald?
You do look a bit like John McDonnell, yeah, but better.
Well, he worked around here, actually. He used to work at Sinston.
Yeah, he used to be a socialist as well. Anyway, I leave that. But thank you.
I don't know what he's done wrong there. Anyway.
Thank you very much for joining us. It was hugely enjoyable as well as educational.
Right.
And next week, fittingly, our first session on the Revolution series is on the Peasant War of 1381, which you might find interesting.
I would.
Certainly some of our comrades find interesting. Yes.
And I'm off to have a beer.
Yes,
and the beer is called Hen Harrier beer, because the hen harriers around here are very famous. But the trouble is the landowners that keep killing them because they eat the grouse, you see. But everything's connected, you know, through food.
Very much. Thanks very much for joining us, Charlie. Thanks everybody for coming along. Mark's going for a beer as well. We're all having a socially distanced beer with each other.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Charlie.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.